What if the most powerful person in the room was the one nobody noticed? Not the director, not the manager, not the loudest voice, but a little girl sitting quietly in the corner of a crowded shelter, drawing. She didn't scream, she didn't complain. She just looked around at the way people were treated and picked up a pencil. And when the CEO of the shelter's parent organization walked in, undercover, disguised as a struggling father, he didn't expect to be moved. He expected to observe, to evaluate, to gather data. But then his daughter, 9-year-old Sophie, was handed a cold breakfast and told not to ask questions. And the moment she quietly handed back a drawing, with a note written in small, nervous handwriting, "If you can't hear us, maybe you can see us." That was the moment everything changed. This story isn't about money. It's not about power. It's about what happens when someone finally stops walking past the quietest voice in the room and chooses to listen. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see how a piece of paper on a wall sparked a transformation in over 20 shelters across the country. And the most powerful person in the story was never the one with the title. The February wind swept down Claymore Street like an unspoken reminder. In this city, winter didn't end with the calendar. It ended when people found a way to survive. At the corner of 7th, where windows were sealed shut and the neon lights flickered as if exhausted, a man and a little girl slowly stepped across the crosswalk. His shoes weren't exactly old, but dust clung thick like they hadn't seen rest in days. On his back, a black backpack bulged with the edges of school books and a folded raincoat. In his other hand, he gripped the small hand of the girl, a hand already cold, but not pulling away. No one paid them any attention. They weren't eye-catching enough, and that was the point. The man went by the name Eli Brennan, at least for the days ahead. But in truth, he was Miles Atwood, founder and CEO of the Urban Way Foundation, once called by Forbes a breath of humanity in the heart of the city. For over a decade, Urban Way had funded more than 60 homeless assistance centers, community recovery hubs, and job training programs across the country. But in recent months, one of those centers, Horizon Haven, had begun to show up in thick reports using the words he hated most: understaffed, opaque, dehumanizing. Cold phrases, but colder still, were the anonymous emails from those who had once found shelter there. "We're not asking for pity, just not to be treated like trash." Miles didn't like boardrooms. He believed that if you wanted to understand a system, you had to touch its foundation. And the foundation of Horizon Haven was its community kitchen, its damp laundry room, and the people who once had names but were now just called cases. But he knew that if he showed up as CEO, the system would instantly adjust, like a machine afraid of the inspector's hand. So he needed a mask. And that mask was Eli Brennan, a recently laid-off single father with a daughter and nowhere else to go. Sophie, his daughter, knew this wasn't a vacation. She was only 9, but her eyes were like her mother's, wide, deep, and not easily fooled by pretty words. Miles had explained everything. She'd be eating simple meals, sleeping in bunk beds, and might hear unpleasant things. Sophie just nodded, then wrapped her arms around his neck. No complaints. They arrived at the gates of Horizon Haven at 6:12 p.m., 12 minutes past intake hours. A tall man stood watch, broad-shouldered, wearing a blue jacket with the center's logo, who glanced at the pair and then at his watch. "Check-in closed at 6, he said without expression. "We just need a place to rest," Miles replied softly. "I have my daughter. We've got nowhere else." "Like I said, it's past time. We can wait outside until morning." The guard sighed as though that would inconvenience his shift. A woman with a name tag, Nina, assistant manager, stepped out from inside. She frowned. "You don't have a referral letter from the police or a shelter?" "No." "Any documentation on income or housing status?" Miles shook his head. Nina looked at Sophie. "How old?" 9. "We can't guarantee medical care for young children. We don't need anything except a quiet corner." After a tense moment, Nina turned back inside, then tossed a paper form at them. No one escorted them in. No guidance. A middle-aged woman sweeping the hallway gave them a sideways glance, then continued mopping, stepping around Sophie as if the girl were a stain that had just appeared. Miles knew this. He had read about it. Dehumanization by silence. It didn't take insults. Just indifference was enough to make someone invisible. They were assigned to room 203B, second floor south wing. Bunk beds, 2 beds, no window. A plain white sign was taped to the wall. No complaints zone. Respect staff. Sophie climbed to the top bunk. The mattress was stiff. No blanket. Miles handed her a folded hoodie. "Where are we, Daddy?" Miles paused. "In a place where a lot of people are trying to survive. Because they don't have homes? Because the world forgot they ever had names." Sophie was silent. After a while, she asked, "Are we going to live here forever?" Number, just a few days. Sophie didn't cry, but her eyes stayed open longer than usual, as if trying to memorize every detail of a world her friends would never know. Dinner that night was white bread, watery bean soup, and bruised apples. The food staff wore gloves, spoke no words. The only one who smiled was a toothless old man who told Sophie, "Careful with the soup, honey. It's hotter than it looks." She giggled quietly. Miles nodded in thanks. A young man was denied a second helping. "Policy," the woman said. He protested and was immediately kicked out to the yard. No one said a word. Back in the room, Sophie pulled a piece of paper from her backpack and began drawing. She didn't ask questions. But 20 minutes later, Miles saw her sketch, a scene of the dining hall with shadowy figures eating under dim lights. In the top left corner stood a little girl behind a pane of glass, separated, without a chair, without a plate. Miles sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Why'd you draw it like that?" Sophie spoke softly. "Because I felt like I wasn't allowed to sit with them." Miles swallowed hard. In his career, he had signed off on millions in funding for inclusion campaigns, catchy slogans on billboards, workforce training programs. But now his own daughter, the smallest person in the room, had spoken aloud a truth no one in the system dared admit. This place didn't welcome them. It merely housed them. He stared at her for a long moment. Inside him, something began to fracture. Not because they'd been rejected, but because, for the first time, he directly felt the real meaning behind the numbers he once approved. "Do you want to name your picture?" he asked. Sophie thought for a while, then answered in a voice that wasn't loud or soft, but carried the scratch of a young soul beginning to understand that the world was unfair. "I'll call it The Room Where Nobody Looks." Miles sat in silence. Outside the hallway window, the wind slipped again through the glass. But this time, it didn't feel as cold as before. Because now he wasn't just a CEO undercover. He was a father who had just realized, if the system can't see a child like Sophie, then that system doesn't deserve to exist. The next morning, no alarm rang, no clock, no announcements, only the heavy footsteps along the concrete hallway and the metallic clanks of steel doors opening in rhythm, like soft but insistent taps on the mind. Sophie woke up before Miles. She was still wearing the hoodie from the night before, her hair tangled, her eyes groggy. Miles gently brushed a few strands of hair off her forehead. "Did you dream?" he asked. "Yes, but I don't remember clearly. Just that everyone was talking loudly, but no one listened to anyone." Miles knew that wasn't just a dream. It was the atmosphere here, thick like the hum of an old AC, always running but never cooling anyone. They went down to the first floor for breakfast. The hallway smelled like a mix of disinfectant, mildew, and something else that resembled surrender. Breakfast was cheap cereal with nearly expired milk. Sophie didn't complain, but when she reached for a second milk carton, since the first had only a few drops left, a kitchen worker walked over and snapped, "One per person, no exceptions." Miles was about to speak, but Sophie looked at him and silently nodded, putting the milk back. The staff member, her name Sandra printed on her badge, gave Miles a look, eyebrows raised like she had just taught a lesson. They found an empty table in the corner, but it was stained with mold and dried coffee rings. An older man tried to sit with them, but a younger guy chased him off. "This spot's been mine since yesterday." No one said anything. No one helped the old man. Breakfast passed in the silence of organized poverty, where hunger wasn't just in the stomach, but in the absence of dignity. After the meal, everyone had to line up to go through the identification room, where management checked names, matched them with lists, and determined who could stay and who had to leave. Miles stood with Sophie, approaching the desk. "Eli Brennan," he said. Nina, the same woman from last night, typed into her keyboard, then looked up at him. No greeting, no smile. "You haven't earned enough trust points to be placed in a priority unit," she said. "You and your daughter will be moved to Zone C starting tomorrow." "What's Zone C?" "For individuals without verified documentation, no unemployment confirmation, no medical or psychological history. And Zone A, Zone B? For people with papers." "What about people with children?" "Only if they meet all three criteria." "So my daughter's being penalized because I don't have documents?" "We don't use the word penalized. We categorize based on the system." Miles stayed silent. A young mother behind him quietly pulled her child out of line, having heard enough to know she didn't belong here either. By noon, a young college volunteer came by handing out center experience evaluation forms. When she gave one to Sophie, she smiled and said, "You can fill one out too if you'd like." Sophie looked at Miles, then said, "I'm not sure anyone will read it." Miles just smiled, not interfering. He knew his daughter no longer saw the world through rose-colored glasses. With each step, each word, Sophie was learning that there was a kind of silence more frightening than cruelty. The kind where the entire system pretends there's nothing wrong. That afternoon, they passed by the kitchen area. A side door swung open, revealing a room where staff were eating pizza and drinking soda, while the residents' meals were reheated in old pots. An old man saw it, then turned away, as if he'd seen that scene more times than he could remember his own name. That evening, room 203B had a new occupant, a young woman named Alicia, tired-faced, clutching a tote with a few pieces of clothing and a stuffed animal. She didn't say much, but when Sophie took out her paper and began to draw, Alicia watched for a moment, then softly asked, "What are you drawing?" Sophie replied, "I'm drawing grown-ups eating in a room with air conditioning and kids waiting outside the door." Alicia looked at Miles. He said quietly, "She sees a lot." That night something happened. A girl in Zone C was yelled at for taking too long in the bathroom. When she protested, a staff member, Curtis, raised his voice, grabbed her arm, and shoved her into the hallway. "I don't care if you're stressed. This is a shelter, not a hotel." The girl pulled away, tears streaming down her face, but no one spoke. Miles stood behind the door, watching it all. Sophie gripped his hand and whispered, "Don't say anything." Miles nodded. He said nothing, but he remembered every word, every face. The next morning during breakfast, Sophie didn't eat. She took out her paper and drew another picture. A woman being pushed out of a bright room, while inside the door, a sign read, "This is not a place for the poor. This is a place for those accepted as poor." Miles didn't need to ask. He knew. His investigation didn't require an Excel sheet or a team of analysts. It only needed a pair of eyes not yet clouded by prejudice, and a small hand, steady enough to draw a truth adults had chosen to forget. When they returned to the room, Sophie asked, "Can I put this picture on the wall?" "Where?" "Near the dining hall." Miles nodded. "Tonight, when no one's watching." Sophie smiled, but it wasn't joy. It was resolve. Miles sat beside his daughter. In his mind, budget numbers, grant proposals, media reports, all suddenly felt meaningless. He no longer wanted to read lines that said, "Horizon Haven serves 2,500 people annually with cost efficiency." He wanted to ask, how many people walk in here and still feel human? And right now the number, based on the clearest, most honest evidence, was 0. The nighttime chill in Horizon Haven didn't come from the weather. It seeped from the thick concrete walls coated in old paint, uninsulated and unfeeling. It was a coldness that didn't touch the skin directly, but sank into the thoughts, as if the place was designed not to heal people, but to silence them. Silence them long enough to stop reacting to what was wrong. Silence them until they began to believe they deserved how they were treated. Miles lay still on the bottom bunk, staring up at the ceiling. On the peeling paint above him, someone had scribbled in pencil, "The only thing I want is not forgiveness, but a look without suspicion." He knew the person who wrote that might still be in the center, or might have left long ago, might have made it through, or fallen apart. No one knew. No one asked. No one remembered. Around midnight, a soft sound echoed from the room next door. A cough, at first sporadic, then urgent and dry. Then came the emergency bell. 3 sharp rings. Miles sat up instantly. He heard footsteps, doors creaking, Sophie turning above him, her small voice whispering, "What's happening, Daddy?" "It's okay. Go back to sleep." But he didn't sleep. 2 minutes later, as the coughing grew worse, he opened the door to the hallway. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, hair snow-white, trembling and clutching his chest, was leaning against the wall, face clenched with difficulty breathing. Another man stood beside him, shouting, "Help! He needs his inhaler!" Miles ran over, helping the old man to sit. "Where's the medical room?" he asked. "End of the hall, but it's only open during the day." Miles lifted the man up, his shoes slipping slightly on the slick floor. He rushed down the corridor and banged on the infirmary door. No response. He banged again, this time with force. A night guard emerged from the admin wing, groggy and annoyed. "What is it?" "This man's having an asthma attack. He needs meds, now." "There's no doctor on night shift." "Then the medicine?" "No one's authorized to dispense after hours." "So you're telling me to lay this man down on the floor and wait for him to stop breathing?" The guard shrugged. "I don't make the rules. I follow them." Miles felt the blood rush to his face, but he took a deep breath. He remembered his daughter's voice. "Don't say anything. Just listen." So he stayed quiet, at least with his mouth. In his mind, every detail was being recorded more clearly than any security camera. And an old truth reemerged. Sometimes systems aren't cruel because they intend to be, but because they've gotten used to not caring. He carried the man back to the room, helped him lie on his side, propped his head with a softer pillow. Another resident handed him an old inhaler, likely unauthorized. Miles didn't ask. He just nodded in gratitude. Back in his room, Sophie was already sitting up, eyes wide with worry. "Is he okay?" "He is now, thanks to someone kind." Sophie was quiet, then asked, "Why do good people have to stay anonymous? What are they afraid of?" Miles sat on the edge of the bed. "Maybe they're afraid of being punished for doing the right thing." "Then this world is wrong, Daddy." He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stroked her hair and looked at the drawings she'd been working on earlier. Sophie had added a new figure, a thin man carrying a hunched old man on his back, both walking past a closed door with a sign overhead. "Not eligible for assistance." Miles sighed. Then he stood, unzipped his backpack, and pulled out a small rectangular device, a professional-grade audio recorder. No signal, no GPS, just one function, to capture sound within a 10-meter radius in high resolution. He had brought it on day one, originally intended to document internal meetings, but now he realized the space that needed recording most wasn't the boardroom, it was the hallway. Early the next morning, he discreetly placed the recorder behind the water dispenser near the kitchen, a place where people often gathered, vented, or said things they thought no one would hear. No need for boardroom microphones, just proximity to the real. And the truest sounds he knew were the ones people made when they thought no one was listening. After breakfast, stale bread and diluted milk, Miles passed by the laundry room. He meant to wash his hands, but overheard 2 staff chatting inside. A female voice, probably Sandra, said, "That kid yesterday looked so dumb. Thought being cute would get her another milk carton?" Laughter followed. A male voice chimed in, "Those types grow up to be leeches anyway." Miles froze. Something dropped inside him, but didn't shatter. It lodged deep, a growing tumor called a system that disguises cruelty as care. He returned to the room. Sophie was reading. She looked up. "Daddy, if someone does something wrong and no one sees it, are they still wrong?" Miles sat down. "If the person hurt still remembers, then the wrong still exists." Sophie nodded. "I'll draw again. Another picture." "What this time?" "A person locked out of a hospital door, while the people inside are drinking tea." Miles looked at his daughter. In that moment, a thought sparked. If a child could draw truth in pictures, what must grown-ups do to preserve justice? He opened his phone and jotted down, print drawings, internal exhibition, one copy for every shelter. Sophie finished the drawing and tucked it into her backpack. That night she whispered, I don't know if anyone cares about the papers I draw, but if even one person sees them, that's enough, right? Miles didn't say a word, but he knew. It wasn't just enough, it was the beginning. Because in a place where everyone looks away, a single gaze directed at the truth has the power to melt an entire frozen system. That day the sky turned overcast with a soft drizzle, and the atmosphere inside Horizon Haven grew so dim it was hard to tell morning from noon. The lights in the dining hall still cast their usual yellow haze, but under that artificial glow, something heavier than usual began to gather in the air. Miles sat with Sophie at a corner table, far from foot traffic. Breakfast was soggy cereal and an underripe banana. Sophie didn't touch her food. She simply held a short pencil Alicia had given her the night before and continued working on a half-finished drawing. A middle-aged man at the next table kept coughing, but no one asked about him, not a single glance. Just as Miles stood to return their food trays, Curtis, the same staff member from the other night, entered, his voice louder than necessary, as if always needing to assert his authority. He scanned the room and stopped right where Sophie sat. There was no clear reason. Maybe it was because she looked different, cleaner, quieter, with wide, unflinching eyes. Or maybe in a place where everything felt dim and drab, the presence of a child bothered him. Curtis walked up to the table, leaned over her drawing, and frowned. Kid, this ain't no art class. Sophie looked up, didn't argue, didn't hide the sketch. Curtis glanced at it, a drawing of a large man pushing a smaller one out of the dining hall, while everyone else continued eating with their heads down. He scoffed. What? Planning to be an artist to escape this place? Miles quickly returned, placing the tray on the table. She's just drawing quietly. She's not bothering anyone. Curtis looked at him for a second, then lowered his voice just enough so Sophie could still hear. Quiet doesn't mean harmless. Kids who watch too much usually grow up to be a problem. Sophie still said nothing. Miles didn't either, but his eyes, if someone had been close enough, would have felt the temperature rising behind them. Curtis leaned in even closer and delivered a sentence that made time stand still. This kid clearly doesn't understand. If you're born into a failure of a family, no matter how hard you try, you're still just a burden. There was no thunderous echo, but the words hit Miles' heart like a sledgehammer. He stood frozen, unreactive. But Sophie wasn't. She looked Curtis straight in the eye, then calmly folded her drawing and tucked it into her hoodie pocket. Not out of fear, but because she understood exactly what had happened and decided not to give anything more to someone unworthy of seeing it. Curtis sneered and turned to walk away. At that moment, the tray in his hand tipped slightly, spilling milk onto the floor. A janitor, bent back, gray-haired, stepped over to mop it up. Curtis didn't apologize, just shrugged and walked out like he was the one educating the world. Breakfast ended in silence, but inside Miles a storm had begun to swell. He didn't rage out loud. He raged with memory. And this time he knew that anger needed a way out, at the right time, in the right place, and in the right way. Not just to defend Sophie, but for everyone who had ever heard something similar and had to stay silent. At noon in the laundry room, Alicia whispered to Miles when no one else was around. I heard about this morning. Curtis has a history of being rough on women and kids. Everyone here knows it, but no one reports him. Anyone who speaks up gets bumped to Zone C or kicked out. Miles nodded but didn't press. He knew better. Truth could illuminate every shadowy corner, but it could also burn the one who held the light if they weren't careful. That afternoon, Sophie retrieved her insulted drawing, added a few lines, and folded it neatly. She asked, Daddy, if someone says something wrong about me and I don't react, does that mean I agree? Miles looked at her for a long moment, then replied, No. Sometimes the best response is to show that they're not worth a response. Sophie nodded, then asked, But what if they do that to someone else? Miles was silent. In that instant, he realized silence could be a strategy, but it couldn't be the solution. And if silence only made the wrong louder, then someone at some point had to break it. That night it rained. The metal roof of the dining hall echoed with steady tapping like a warning drumbeat. Sophie couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, the folded drawing on her lap, staring at it. "I added more," she said. Miles came closer and saw the new image. Still the shelter, but now a child was removing a sign that read, "No complaints zone," and replacing it with one that said, "If nobody listens, then I will draw." Miles stared at the picture, then at her. No words were needed. He understood. Every detail, every sentence, every insult from Curtis was no longer just a personal wound. It had become evidence. And beneath this rain-soaked sky, he made a new decision. Once Sophie fell asleep, he quietly stepped out of the room and walked to the water dispenser, where he had placed the first audio recorder, and replaced it with a second device. The first one had captured 3 full days. The second he would place near the laundry room, where Curtis and Sandra often gathered, where stories flowed as if no one were listening. But they were wrong. When he returned to the room, Sophie was asleep, still clutching her drawing. Miles gently covered her with a thin blanket, then sat in the wooden chair beside the bed. He opened his phone and drafted an email. Unsent, saved as a draft. "Dear Board of Directors, if you are reading this email, it means I have completed 3 days of direct immersion at Horizon Haven. What I've gathered is not data, it's truth. It cannot be explained away, it cannot be ignored, and it cannot be allowed to continue." He didn't sign his name. Not yet. But that day was coming. Before going to sleep, Miles reopened the first note Sophie had written when they arrived, before she had the courage to speak out loud. A line, childish and scrawled, "If someone's already hurt, don't kick them again. Give them a place to sit," he whispered like a vow in the dark. "You won't have to draw that ever again, Sophie." That morning, the sky remained overcast, but the rain had stopped. Wind swept through the back courtyard of Horizon Haven, carrying loose paper scraps from the dining area down the corridor, as if the sky itself were trying to expose something long forgotten. Miles woke early. Sophie was still asleep, clutching her notebook and the carefully folded drawing tucked inside her hoodie. He stepped quietly out of the room, carrying recorder number 3, the last in the set he'd brought from headquarters. This time, he placed the device at the base of the sink near the kitchen, where Sandra and Curtis often chatted at the end of their shifts. Close enough to catch everything. He didn't need a camera, just words spoken at the right time, by the right people, enough for the system to expose its own shadow. When he returned, Sophie was awake, her face more contemplative than usual. Not sad, just still, like something inside her had solidified overnight. A thought fully formed. She spoke quietly, eyes down. "I want to hang the drawing." Miles looked at her. "Now?" Sophie nodded. "By the kitchen. There's a white wall. Nothing's on it. It's empty." He considered for a few seconds, then nodded. They walked out together. The hall was mostly empty. It was laundry pickup time. The wall Sophie had mentioned really was the only untouched surface in a corridor full of administrative slogans. No notices, no warnings, nothing at all. Sophie pulled out the drawing, carefully flattened it. In the picture, a child holding a pencil stood before a silent crowd, the adults behind her turning their backs. And above, instead of sky, a handwritten line read, "If no one will say it, I will draw it." Miles handed her the tape. Sophie affixed the drawing with care. No rush, no hiding, as if it were a ritual, a declaration. No one stood nearby. No one saw, yet. But that didn't matter. The first step had been taken. That afternoon, a few people paused to look. They didn't speak, but they stopped. One gray-haired man with a limp stood for a long time, then turned to Miles. "That girl, she gets it more than we ever did. I used to write letters when I lived here. No one ever wrote back. After that, I stopped. But seeing her drawing, I think maybe I was wrong to stop." Miles said nothing. The man nodded and walked away. A little later, Alicia came by. She silently took a photo of the drawing on her phone. She didn't post it, didn't share it, just saved it, as if to remember that something true and beautiful had once existed in this place. Around 4 p.m., Sandra spotted the drawing. She frowned, looked at it for a moment, then called over Curtis. He read the words and scoffed. Dissatisfied artist. Should have burned those pages for warmth. Sandra hesitated. Should we take it down? Curtis replied, wait until tonight. No one sees it, no fuss. Gone tomorrow. Miles stood behind the utility cabinet, just 2 steps away, recorder still rolling. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. He let them speak, let them expose themselves. That night the drawing was still there. Sophie came to check and found it untouched. She whispered, I thought they'd take it down by now. Miles replied, they haven't, because they're not brave enough to admit it's true. Sophie smiled. Then I'll draw more. In their room under the dim nightlight, Sophie created another drawing. This time, an adult sitting on the ground, head bowed, surrounded by children offering tiny pencils. Miles looked at his daughter and realized something no report, no spreadsheet, no meeting ever revealed. Collective trauma wasn't healed through campaigns. It began with one small drawing and a wall humble enough to hold it. The next morning at breakfast, something unusual happened. 2 more pieces of paper had been added beside Sophie's drawing. One was handwritten in blue ink, clearly by a man, unsigned. I used to think silence was enough to survive. But after seeing this drawing, I realized survival isn't enough. The other was a rough sketch of a room with an open door. Beneath it the words, if there's room for drawings, maybe there's room for people. Miles read them, then turned to Sophie. She smiled. This time it was genuine. Not a smile to brush things off, but the smile of someone who had just witnessed change taking root. That same day, Riley, one of the few kind souls left in the admin wing, found Miles in the laundry area. She whispered, I know you're not just a regular guy, but I won't ask. I just wanted to say, thank you for not yelling. We're used to being shouted at here. But your silence, more people heard it than you think. Miles simply smiled. Sometimes to see the cracks in the wall, it takes something so small no one expects it to matter. But it's the small things that make the foundation split. Riley nodded. She walked away without saying more. But that afternoon she quietly pinned up a note herself. If anyone sees this drawing and understands it, protect it. Don't let it be erased. Because if even a drawing isn't allowed to exist, what chance does a person have? Miles no longer needed to wonder whether his plan was working. He had seen it. In the eyes of those who once avoided looking up. In the hands of those who had given up. Now silently folding notes and placing them on cafeteria tables like whispered hellos. And in Sophie's eyes, the eyes of a child who had never heard the phrase organizational policy, but understood deeply what was right, Miles knew. A reform could begin right in the heart of a place that no one thought could listen anymore. That day the sky cleared. After so many gray days, the first rays of sun slipped through the dusty window panes of Horizon Haven like an apology no one had asked for. But inside the shelter, no one looked up to greet the light. No one believed sunlight could change anything, because what they'd lacked for so long wasn't light. It was reflection. There were no mirrors here, not because they were afraid of broken glass, but because they were afraid to face the image of someone who had come to believe they were no longer worth seeing. Sophie woke up early, quietly folding her drawings into the pocket of her hoodie. She didn't speak, but Miles understood what was on her mind. He glanced at the sketch poking out, a new one, unfinished. Just the outline of an adult standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection was a child, crying. No colors, only pencil lines. But it was enough for him to realize. Sophie was asking the biggest question yet. What turns children into adults who stop caring? That morning's breakfast was nothing special, cold cereal and dry bread. But when Miles and Sophie reached their table, 2 others were already seated. Alicia and a man named Tony, usually the quietest of the residents. They didn't say much, only nodded at Sophie. On the table sat a small folded note. They tried to remove it last night. We put it back. Sophie opened it, read, and smiled. That day in the dining hall, the drawing was still up. And for the first time, someone greeted Sophie as they passed. An elderly man, lifting his gaze from his tray for the first time, whispered, "That little girl, she's the mirror for this whole place." No one reacted, but no one disagreed. Miles realized then, That wall had become a mirror, not one that reflected appearance, but one that reflected character. People passing by the drawing didn't see their faces, but they saw something they'd tried to forget, that they once had feelings, once had dreams, once had a sense of justice. And now they lived in a place where all of that had been folded up, like Sophie's drawings, waiting either to be posted or torn down. Around noon, Curtis walked into the dining room and saw a small crowd gathered around the drawing. He frowned and marched over. But this time something was different. No one moved aside for him like they usually did. Sandra followed a few steps behind, slower, watching the room's reaction. Curtis stared at the drawing for a long time, then scoffed. Stuff like this doesn't help anyone. Whoever made this clearly never did real work. Sophie stood nearby. She didn't flinch, didn't respond with words. She simply pulled a folded paper from her pocket, a sketch of a janitor mopping in the dark, next to the line. If you can't see someone's work, don't say they didn't work. She taped it beside the larger drawing. This time no one laughed. No one touched it. Curtis turned away and muttered, "Bunch of lunatics." But his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Miles, standing in the distance, knew. A mirror doesn't need to beautify. It only needs to be honest enough to make the imposter too ashamed to linger. That afternoon, Miles received an anonymous message through the shelter's internal network, accessible only to staff. It was brief. "You don't look like someone here for a bed. I know who you are, and I know what you're doing. If you truly want to help, meet me at the back courtyard at 10 p.m. Alone." It was signed Riley. Miles didn't respond, didn't delete it. He read it once, closed the phone. Then he told Sophie, "Tonight, go to bed early. Tomorrow we'll do something important." "What is it?" "Help someone look into a mirror without shame." That night he arrived at the courtyard on time. Riley stood there, wearing a long coat, holding a thin folder. No greeting. She got straight to the point. "I've been in charge of financial support here for over 4 years. I know the expenses, I know the grants, and I know where the money's really going. But I don't have hard proof. The accounting software has been locked by upper management. Why are you helping me?" "Because of that little girl. I've never seen anyone allow a child to tell the truth in a place where adults are afraid to breathe too loudly." Miles nodded. "I'll need a few things. Copies of all expense reports from the past 3 months, inventory logs, and the staff payroll. I can get most of it, but it'll take a few days. I'll need to access the system overnight." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I don't want to become someone who looks in a mirror and sees nothing." They left without a handshake. No phone numbers exchanged. Only the silent agreement, the rarest kind. The silence between people who already know what must be done. The next morning, Sophie posted a new drawing on the now iconic wall. No one told her she was allowed to, but no one stopped her either. The sketch showed a giant mirror in the center of a room, surrounded by people. All of them looking down, too afraid to face it. But in the mirror's center, the reflection wasn't a face. It was a message. If you look away too long, you forget what you look like. Miles stood behind his daughter, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Is this the last one you'll draw here?" Sophie answered, "I have lots more ideas, but this one's enough to make them think." He nodded, not from pride, but from understanding. Once truth has been reflected, even if the mirror is shattered, the fragments still reflect. And those fragments, no matter how small, can still cut through the ropes called silence. It was their 7th night at Horizon Haven, though it felt like an entire season had passed. The wall near the dining hall now held 4 drawings, each one preserved not by tape, but by the invisible protection of quietly approving eyes. No one dared to publicly admit they believed in those drawings, but no one dared to tear them down either. These thin pieces of paper were doing what the entire rule system could not, reminding people what it felt like to be seen. That evening, Sophie went to bed early. Miles sat by her bedside for a long time, not out of fear of what might happen, but because he knew that the next morning would be unlike any other before it. He had gathered enough evidence, 3 audio recorders, dozens of hours of footage, cruel remarks, dismissed complaints, and conversations among staff referring to clearing out the troublemakers, like they were talking about garbage. He had also received Riley's first email, copies of budget allocations and food procurement from the past quarter. Numbers don't lie, but they only gain meaning when laid beside ground truth. And that truth was this. The $3 per person meal had been inflated to $10. Frozen meat labeled organic local had been sourced from expired stock. Special funding for children under 12 had been rerouted to internal event expenses. Miles had dealt with cases like this before, but this time he didn't need investigators. He only needed a child who could draw and a mirror that couldn't be bent. Around midnight, Miles quietly left the room and went to the administrative wing. He accessed the main computer using the temporary login Riley had provided. Instead of saving the data to a private device, he copied everything into a folder titled simply, Listen. Inside, he compiled audio clips of Curtis referring to residents as animals, Sandra mocking happy beggars, and both of them discussing taking down the drawings before someone mistook the place for a museum. He didn't trim or edit. Every file was labeled with the speaker's name, date, and recording location, clear as a mirror at noon. Before leaving, he placed a small USB stick into the drawer of Helen, the center's director. On the casing was a single line. No one speaks anymore, but everyone is listening. Beside it, he placed a folded, full-color copy of one of Sophie's drawings. For the first time printed, a woman looking into a mirror, with dozens behind her watching. Yet the reflection showed only a pair of tearful eyes. The next morning, Helen didn't show up. No notice. No explanation. Rumors swirled that she'd been summoned to headquarters for internal review. But everyone knew. Everyone had seen. Curtis disappeared as well. Sandra was reassigned to the night shift, avoiding the busiest hours. These changes didn't require meetings or votes. They only needed silence. But this time, it wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the heavy silence of a reckoning. By afternoon, a new notice appeared on the main bulletin board. Staff kitchen access suspended during peak hours. All food supplies to undergo transparent inventory checks. No name, no signature. But Riley knew. Miles knew. And Sophie drew another picture. A loudspeaker with its mouth locked shut. But inside the words echoed, "The louder you try to hide, the clearer we will hear." That noon, Miles took Sophie for a walk around the courtyard. A young woman, seeing them for the first time since the week began, approached and whispered, "I used to work here. Quit after 3 months. They threatened me for speaking too much. But now, I see her drawings every morning, and I feel like I can stand up straight again." Sophie smiled. Didn't speak. Just handed the woman a blank sheet of paper. "You can draw too." By early evening, a light thunderstorm rolled in. For the first time since arriving, Miles sensed something in the air had shifted. Not because the director was gone, not because of new memos, but because he heard something he hadn't heard in days. Laughter. Soft, unforced laughter. An old man telling a story. A woman greeting someone first instead of waiting to be addressed. Small sounds, but proof that the old silence had been cracked. That night, Miles didn't record anything. He sat beside Sophie as the two of them colored in an unfinished drawing together. Sophie said, "I don't know where my drawings will end up. Maybe they'll take them down. Maybe they'll stay up. But either way, I put them up when they were needed most." Miles nodded. "That's exactly why you draw. Not so they last forever, but so someone, just once, might stop and see themselves in it." Sophie tilted her head. "Is that really enough, Daddy?" "Enough," Miles said, "and more than enough." That night, a gentle breeze carried the earthy scent of post-rain soil through Horizon Haven. The shelter was no longer quiet in the usual way. It had sound, not of conflict or grief, but of people learning how to raise their voices again. And in that space, the most dangerous kind of silence, the one that had swallowed countless right things for far too long, had finally been broken by a child, a drawing, and one quiet man who chose to listen. Monday, 6:30 a.m. On the third floor of the Urban Way Foundation headquarters, Conference Room 5 had its lights on early. It was a room no one liked to use, not because of its location nor its design, but because it had witnessed internal audits, PR crisis sessions, and meetings that always ended in silence and resignation. On the wall, a slightly crooked oil painting of the Brooklyn Bridge hung as if the room itself struggled to stay balanced, barely and only just. Miles Atwood had arrived at 6:10. No suit, no tie. A white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, his expression calm, as if he had just come from a team huddle rather than spending the last week immersed in the dust and disappointment of a system he had once built. On the table before him was a thick file, no plastic cover, no colored graphs, just a single handwritten title in ink, Before They Speak. At exactly 7 a.m., the door opened. 4 people entered. Helen, the director of Horizon Haven, walked in first, face cold, back straight, as if she had prepped a full rebuttal to any and all accusations. Curtis followed, eyes darting nervously, holding an untouched cup of coffee. Sandra came next, maintaining her usual half-bored, half-dismissive expression. Last was Riley, walking slowly, gaze steady, unflinching, expressionless. None of them had been told Miles would be present. The meeting invite had come from the Compliance Review Department, vague and procedural. But when they saw Miles seated at the head of the table, there was no mistaking what this was. Helen broke the silence first. "I don't know the purpose of this meeting, but I will need legal counsel if—" Miles raised a hand. "I think it'll become clear very soon." He clicked the remote. A large screen lit up. An audio clip began to play, 18 seconds long. Curtis's voice unmistakable. "I don't care if that guy's got a kid or not. They come here. They're a burden, not guests. If you want kindness, don't be poor." Helen turned to Curtis, lips tightening. Sandra didn't react. Miles continued. No yelling, no emotion, just facts. "That's the first of 14 audio clips recorded over 5 days at Horizon Haven. Verbal abuse, dehumanization, discrimination, abuse of authority, financial fraud, all fully documented." He opened the file and placed a copy in front of each of them. Inflated food invoices, payroll for ghost employees, event budgets diverted to private staff meals, photos, receipts, log entries. It's all here. Helen held her breath. Riley remained quiet. Curtis finally blurted out, "This is a privacy violation. You didn't tell us." Miles looked up, steady. "And you think treating a child like trash is something that deserves protection?" Curtis fell silent. Sandra turned her head away. Helen placed her hands on the table. "If you believe mismanagement occurred, there must be a formal process, an investigation. You can't draw conclusions." Miles cut her off. "You built that process. You shaped that system. But I don't need a process to know that calling a child a burden in a place advertised as a safe haven is a failure. I don't need paperwork to condemn what I heard. Sick people denied meds, the elderly turned away, low-wage staff intimidated, and residents threatened into silence just to keep a bed." Helen stayed silent. Curtis stood up. "I'm not sitting here for a public shaming." Miles nodded. "You won't need to, because you no longer hold a position to be shamed in." He took out his phone and pressed send. An email immediately went out to the entire Urban Way Board of Directors. Termination notice for Curtis D. Fisher, effective immediately, for ethical misconduct and violation of internal code of conduct. Sandra stared down as her phone lit up. Miles turned to her. "Sandra, your misuse of restricted budgets over the past 2 years will be submitted to the Independent Ethics Committee. Effective immediately, you are suspended indefinitely and barred from facility access." Helen inhaled deeply but didn't respond. Miles looked her in the eye. "You will retain your role for 3 more days, only to transition full administrative control to Riley Beckett, the only one who stood up when everyone else chose to look down." Riley's eyes widened. Helen gave a slow, silent nod. No protest, no plea. She knew the game was over, not because someone shouted louder, but because no one dared to lie anymore. The meeting ended without applause. No tears, just a room that felt lighter, as if it had finally exhaled the stale air of compromise. Before leaving, Miles handed Riley a small box. Inside was a color scan of one of Sophie's drawings, the very first to be printed, a child standing before a blank wall, pencil in hand, with hundreds of shadowy figures behind her, all beginning to turn and look. The caption read, It only takes one drawing to make a wall impossible to ignore. Riley took the box and said nothing. But in her eyes there was something like the first ray of sunlight after rain. Not blinding, but enough to know morning had arrived. 3 days after the anonymous boardroom meeting, Horizon Haven looked entirely different. Though there were no new signs, no architectural changes, no grand declarations. The transformation had started with things so small, you'd think no one noticed. Breakfast no longer meant dry bread, but freshly baked rolls with the scent of butter. A new staff member handing out food smiled as he passed the tray to the first resident. The old sign that once read "No Complaints Zone" had been replaced with a handwritten note. If you need to be heard, right here. Below it was a small wooden box and a few fresh pens. Sophie had written the first line, "Sometimes a picture is the first way someone learns to talk." That morning, Miles walked into the dining area with Sophie and felt none of the suffocating weight of those early days. A few people greeted him, not by name, but with their eyes. The security guard who once turned him away now gave a subtle nod. No one spoke of the past, but everyone knew something had shifted, and there was no turning back. That afternoon, Riley was officially introduced as interim director in an internal staff meeting. She didn't give a speech. She simply stepped up to the front, holding a printout of Sophie's very first drawing, raised it above her head and said, "If you've never seen yourself in this picture, then maybe we've never truly worked here." Miles didn't attend the meeting. He and Sophie spent the afternoon walking through the back courtyard, where the cracked paving stones had been cleared of litter. On the cement, Sophie used chalk to draw a circle. Inside were two figures, one sitting down, one standing beside them with a hand resting gently on their shoulder. Below it, she wrote, "Some people don't need a shelter. They need a witness." That drawing was photographed, printed in color, and placed in Riley's new office, beside a large corkboard. She named it, "The Wall of Witness." Anyone, resident, staff, volunteer, could pin up a drawing, a story, or a message. And no one predicted that within just 1 week the board would be full. One person shared how they'd been denied help once for wearing the wrong clothes. Another pinned a photo of their niece, who had been told she was unfit for school because she lived in a shelter. Someone simply posted a note, "I still haven't forgiven myself for staying silent the night my friend was evicted in the rain." Miles quietly observed it all. No one knew he was the founder of Urban Way. He still went by Eli Brennan. Riley knew, but had not revealed it. She respected his silence. Not the old institutional silence, but the kind born of understanding timing, and that timing was approaching. By week's end, an emergency board meeting was called at Urban Way's Midtown headquarters. For the first time since leaving Horizon Haven, Miles entered as himself. The entire board stood when he walked in, but he didn't sit at the head of the table. He stood at the center, holding a canvas print of one of Sophie's drawings, and placed it in the middle of the table. It showed a man in a necktie mopping the floor. Behind him, two children watched, one laughing, one crying. In the top right corner, in slanted handwriting, "You don't need to wear a name tag to be responsible." "This," Miles said, "is the only report I want you to read before any spreadsheet. Not because it's full of data, but because it hides nothing." He told them about Horizon Haven, not in bullet points or percentages, but like a wound that had finally started healing only after its infection was laid bare for all to see. He didn't say how many days he lived there, didn't name names. He simply said, "I used to believe a system only needed to function, but I forgot that it was built to serve people, not make them prove they deserve an extra carton of milk for their child." No one challenged him. No one debated. Because when truth no longer hides behind a report, but lives in an image, there's nothing left to argue. And those images weren't propaganda. They were testimony from a community that had been ignored. The board unanimously voted to launch a new initiative called the Drawing Project, a program to embed narrative art into every Urban Way center, enabling residents to express emotion, call out injustice, and rebuild the system from the perspective of those who lived inside it. Miles nominated Riley to become the national program coordinator. The vote was unanimous. The following week, in an internal live stream broadcast to every center, Riley told Sophie's story, without names, without pictures, referring only to the girl who drew what others were afraid to say. At the end of the video, she held up the first drawing, now framed, the child standing alone before a crowd turning its back. We used to look away, but she made us look back. And once we did, we couldn't unsee it. Miles didn't attend the live stream. He and Sophie were sitting in a small park near Horizon Haven. Sophie was sketching a bridge. Below it, people walked forward. At the center of the bridge, a sign read, "This bridge wasn't built with stone. It was built with seeing." He asked, "What's the title of this one?" Sophie replied without looking up, "How to Cross Over." Miles looked at her, then at the bridge, and he knew. They had finally begun the thing he had searched for his entire life. Not just relief, but a new way of seeing. 1 week after the live stream, Urban Way received over 3,000 emails. Not complaints, but drawings. From satellite centers, former residents, ex-staff, and even people who had once stood at the gates but never made it inside. They didn't send these to be recognized as artists. They sent them to be seen. A 7-year-old boy in Seattle drew himself sleeping in a car with his mother. Outside the window, the sign read, "No one should sleep in a car, but we did, for 3 months." A man from Ohio drew a hand reaching from a dumpster, next to the words, "I scavenged even the things that once were people." A 16-year-old girl sketched her bare feet standing outside a legal aid office. "They said I was too young to speak for myself, so I drew it." Riley ran out of space in her office to hang the drawings. She transferred them to Urban Way's headquarters and proposed a special exhibition room, the room that speaks. When Miles approved it, she said simply, "We're hearing from people who never had a microphone." He nodded. "And sometimes they don't need a mic. They just need blank paper." Meanwhile, Horizon Haven continued to change, day by day. There were no new budgets, no extra staff, but something had shifted at the core. Meals were now prepared by residents with cooking experience. In the intake room, Sophie's drawing hung with a welcoming line beneath it. "This is not a place to stay. This is a place to start again." Riley implemented a new policy requiring every staff member to complete at least one reflection shift, a duty with no tasks, just observation and journaling, as if they were residents themselves. She called it mirror duty. During one of these shifts, a staff member named Jeremy, once indifferent and once depicted by Sophie as a blank-faced figure, left a handwritten note in the comment box. "I used to follow every procedure, but I forgot to look at people. Today, I started over by asking them their names." He signed it. No anonymity, no hiding. One quiet weekend afternoon, Miles and Sophie returned to Horizon Haven. No one knew. No one waited. But when they passed the dining hall, Miles stopped in his tracks. The wall that once held just one drawing was now completely filled. Artworks, sketches, quotes, notes, and even poems. And in the center, Sophie's first drawing remained. It had been framed with cardboard. A line added beneath, "Do not remove." "This is the one that saw us first." Riley approached, holding a new print. "I think your daughter should sign it. People keep asking, 'Who's the little artist?'" Sophie shook her head. "I don't want it to have my name. I want people to think it could be theirs." Miles placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "When you drew that first picture, who did you think would see it?" Sophie thought for a moment. "Maybe someone like me. Someone who was quiet but still wanted others to know they were here." Miles nodded. "Well now, the whole system knows they're here." Before leaving, Sophie walked to a new whiteboard recently installed beside the wall of witness. She picked up a marker and wrote the first line. "This board is for the kids, because sometimes we know more than grown-ups think." Miles stood back. He didn't edit her words, didn't add a single thing. He let her write what needed to be said, and then they left Horizon Haven the same way they came, without announcement, without fanfare. But they left behind a place no longer defined by what it used to be, a place that had once been a stopover and was now a beginning. A week later, Urban Way launched a national initiative called Board of Dignity, a program giving residents real power in the shelter system. Every center would be required to appoint at least one former resident to its local advisory board. At Horizon Haven, the first person invited was Alicia. During her appointment ceremony, she said only one sentence. "I wasn't chosen to speak before, Now I choose to speak for those who still aren't. Riley stood quietly in the back of the room. Miles sent a short letter. Just one line. From now on, it doesn't matter who the CEO is, only who's listening. And somewhere in another office, a designer began printing Sophie's artwork on notebooks, t-shirts, and greeting cards for the new fundraising campaign, Art with Voice. On the back of every item, in small letters with no name and no logo, was a single line. This started with a girl and a pencil. What will you draw next? One afternoon in March, as green buds began to sprout on the trees in the park, and the sparrows returned to perch on the rusted iron fence behind Horizon Haven, Miles Atwood stood silently before the small bulletin board near the dining hall. He wore a dark jacket, a low-brimmed cap, and carried a paper bag filled with bread and apple juice. No one recognized him as the man who had once dismissed the shelter's director and restructured the entire system. He didn't need to be recognized. No name, no spotlight, no credit. All he needed was to see that this place had finally begun to look back at itself. The corner where Sophie had once taped her very first drawing had become a makeshift gallery. Sketches by residents, handwritten poems, and scrawled thoughts from someone who hadn't spoken aloud in 3 years now adorned the walls. Among them was a freshly pinned note, written in blue ink. The first day I arrived, I thought this place was just another version of hell. But today, a kid smiled at me and asked if I wanted to sit with them. I think maybe this place is changing. Miles sat on a wooden bench by the small rear playground, the very place where he and Sophie had once spoken about a place to begin again. From his pocket, he pulled out a handwritten letter, signed by a staff member at another center participating in the Mirror Duty program. In the letter, the writer described crying in the laundry room after watching an elderly woman be denied use of a dryer because it wasn't her turn, even though no one else was in line. I don't know why something so small hurt so much, the letter said, but then I remembered your daughter's drawing, and I understood. We're not hurt by broken rules. We're hurt by ignored humanity. Miles folded the letter and placed it in his wallet. Just then, an old man sat beside him, resting a broken wooden cane across his knees. The man gazed at the playground, where a group of children were pushing each other around on a worn plastic cart. I lived here for 3 years, then moved out. Now I'm back, volunteering, not for the money. I just don't want anyone to eat cold bread anymore. Miles chuckled quietly. The man nodded. You look familiar. Can't place where I've seen you. Miles looked at him, then shook his head. Maybe we once sat side by side staring down, and now we're finally looking up. The man laughed. That's a good line. Inside the building, Riley was on a video call with 6 other sites piloting the Board of Dignity model. She introduced a new idea. Witness circles, small weekly groups of 3 to 5 people, including former residents, current ones, and staff. The purpose wasn't to solve problems, but to tell what they'd seen. Not everyone can change the system, Riley said, but everyone can tell the truth. And if enough people tell the same truth, the system will have no choice but to change in order to survive. After the meeting, she stepped outside and spotted Miles sitting beneath a tree. She didn't greet him loudly, didn't bring up policy. She just sat beside him, like an old friend. Together, they watched the kids playing. Sophie wasn't among them. That day, she was attending an art-sharing event at the city library, where children from nearby shelters were invited to draw their imagined homes. Riley asked, "What do you think she'll draw?" Miles replied, "Not a house. Probably a table, with 2 chairs and 1 empty seat, for someone she thinks the world forgot." Riley nodded slowly. "That girl, she knows more than we ever thought. Maybe we were all like her once. We just forgot." Miles checked his watch. "I should go." "Will you come back?" Riley asked. He shook his head. "I don't need to. This place doesn't need its founder anymore. It just needs someone who listens. And now those people are here." Before leaving, he handed her a small box. "One last print. Sophie had it made. It's for the center." Riley opened the box. Inside was a large framed color print. The drawing depicted a dining room, clearly inspired by Horizon Haven, bathed in golden light, with a long wooden table surrounded by people of every shape and story. One in an old coat, one barefoot, one in a wheelchair. And every single one of them was smiling. At the center stood a child, their gender ambiguous, holding a sign that read, Table of Dignity. On the back in Sophie's handwriting, a quiet note. If you don't know where to sit, sit with the ones who remember how it felt to be alone. Miles turned and walked toward the exit. No one took a photo. No one called his name. No one tried to stop him. But with every step he took, a voice echoed in his memory. Not Sophie's, not Riley's, but from an old resident who had once whispered in the hallway. We don't need a CEO. We need someone willing to stand still when everyone else walks past. And now the once coldest wall at Horizon Haven bore a new name. The room that saw us. There were no mirrors in it, but everyone who entered saw themselves. 1 month after Sophie's final drawing was framed at Horizon Haven, a short video was quietly sent to every Urban Way center across the country. There was no logo, no music. It opened on a pair of weathered hands resting on an old laptop, a scratched silver ring glinting faintly on one finger. Then came a voice, low, imperfect, with the cadence of someone who had learned English later in life. But it was steady, unmistakable. I used to think I had to speak like others to be respected, but it turns out the only thing I needed was someone patient enough to listen. The voice belonged to Mr. Yuto, a retired technician who had once lived at Horizon Haven for 2 years, and one of the first to quietly retape Sophie's drawing every time someone tore it down. The video gave no names, but anyone who had lived through rainy nights in that place recognized those hands. The same hands that once steadied a broken cane, that opened the laundry room door for an elder who'd been denied a turn. In the video, Mr. Yuto described the first time he saw Sophie's drawing. I thought it was just a child's sketch, but the longer I looked, the more I saw a question. If you walk past what's right and do nothing, how long do you still deserve to be here? The video was only 2 minutes long, but by its end, hundreds of comments flooded Urban Way's internal platform. Some wrote, I used to walk past too. Others, I'm still standing still. But today I turned back. There was no grand ceremony at Horizon Haven, no ribbon cutting, no press, just one quiet change. In every kitchen across Urban Way's 27 centers, from San Francisco to New York, a pale beige sheet of paper appeared in the back corner wall across from the stove. No one knew who put them there, but each one was handwritten in the same blue ink in both English and Spanish. No name, just a message. Don't serve food with a heart that's angry. Don't wipe the table with a hand that's rushing. Don't welcome someone if you've forgotten what it felt like to be unwelcome. At Horizon Haven, people began calling it the drawing wall. It was no longer a place for shift rosters or posted rules. It became the space where people went to remember why they stood there in the first place, not to distribute meals, but to give someone a place to belong. Weeks later, Sophie was invited to speak at a national community recovery forum in Washington, D.C. Organizers wanted to honor her, interview her, tie her name to the movement. She accepted, but on one condition. I don't want to be introduced as the girl who made the drawing. I just want to sit in the middle row. And if I see someone who's never been asked anything, I'll sit next to them. During the forum, a panelist asked, how can we teach kids about justice in society? Sophie answered, not loudly, not from a script. Maybe start by asking us who in our class always eats lunch alone. The room fell silent, then applause. But Sophie didn't bow. She simply gave a soft smile, the kind of smile someone gives when they know. If something is right, it doesn't need to be explained. Back home, Sophie and Miles walked together along a quiet suburban street. They stopped in front of a new bakery with a sign that read, Table for All. Inside, a large print of Sophie's original drawing hung on the wall. The owner stepped out, recognized Miles, but didn't ask anything. He simply said, I used to live at Haven. Every time I see someone eating alone, I remember that drawing. So now I always say hello first. Miles didn't respond. Sophie turned to him. Daddy, if people forget my name one day, would that make you sad? He knelt to her eye level. Number as long as they remember that seat was once there. Sophie thought for a second, then nodded. Then I've drawn enough. They continued walking. The street was quiet, but behind them, the story kept moving forward. Not by headlines, not by awards, but by walls no one used to look at, now slowly being rewritten, with memory, with courage, with the belief that if just one child dares to draw the truth, the entire system must relearn how to see. Some stories don't need to end with applause, only a changed gaze. So if you've ever walked past someone who needed to be heard, stop next time. If you've ever felt overlooked, know that somewhere a drawing was made so you could see yourself in it. And if this story reached you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who might need it. And don't forget to subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that others leave untold.